Hello, it's John Heaton, and tonight I'm going to discuss what has to be one of the favourite topics of all Beatles fans, if not the favourite. The hypothetical putting together of Beatles albums after the split. And I was probably inspired to do this by James Griffith's recent video on asking people would they have had it any other way versus the way it happened, the split, etc. Interesting to see all the responses and the video response James made summarising, so thanks for that. I have to say this is not a new activity for me. I've been doing it more or less since the late 70s, early 80s. I actually made 4 double cassettes, I think, of hypothetical Beatles albums. I think the first 3 were from the mid-70s, early mid-70s, and then the last one covering the Back to the Egg double fantasy period, 79-80. I think I seem to remember I made 3 copies. I gave one to a friend of mine and kept one, and I can't remember. But anyway, I do remember one copy of those cassettes got stolen from my car. So someone out there is in possession of these precious Heaton Beatles album compilations, and I was pretty proud. It was in the days, when you used to record cassettes off of records, and then when CDs came along, certainly to begin with, it wasn't very easy to do that off records, so that kind of went out the window. But we used to spend ages putting together these compilations, or I did anyway, and discussing them with friends, and should it be a double album, should it be a single? Because I think John Lennon, he said several things after the split which were very interesting. One of them was we would have had to make a double album every time because there wasn't any room, which would have been a little bit ridiculous. And also in that, I think it was in the same 1971 New York interview with David Wigg. David Wigg was saying, any chance of a reconciliation of the group ever? And John was saying, if people really want it that bad, all they have to do is put it on tape. One of John, one of me, one of Paul, one of George, one of Ringo. If they really need it that bad, that's what they can do, and that's exactly what I did, and that's exactly what many of you out there probably did too. And it's a glorious activity. And obviously, we're going to disagree on what to put. So I went to England recently, and on the plane on the way over, I just jotted down some selections, and actually I've mislaid my jottings, so I've had to recreate them. So I'm going to make several videos, but I created a single Beatles album, 14 tracks. I think it was 7 on each side, sort of a la how they used to be in the old days, Rubber Soul and stuff. And then maybe I did 1970, 71, 72, 73, 74, 75, all on that plane journey, and the 79, 80 I haven't got around to doing. I haven't decided whether that should be a single or a double. So, before I take you through the listings, I've selected 14 songs, and then I got a couple of bonus tracks on the end, so had the album existed at the time, it would no doubt have been re-released on CD, and with a couple of bonus tracks. So I've got 2 at the end because it's so difficult, particularly in 1970, to keep it to a single album, because the quality of their solo output was of such high quality and so voluminous. It's really hard, but anyway, in the spirit of the fact that the Beatles normally put out single albums, I know they put out the White Album and it was brilliant, and it is one of their best, if not the best. I've kept it to a single, and here is 1970. So, and I'll also just like to point out, obviously in the interest of space, I've had to leave off a hell of a lot of great material. And I've also left off some songs which I couldn't that easily imagine as Beatles songs. There's certain solo songs which you would die for the group to have had a go at, and there are others where you think, well, that probably belongs as a Lennon solo song or a George solo song or something like that. I haven't always stuck to that rule. I've been a bit mischievous in the track listing, as you'll see. But for example, I won't spoil it, but there are some great songs left off. So I'm not going to show you. I'll show you at the end, the final listing. But side 1 kicks off with the Lennon rocker Remember, which is a highlight of Plastic Ono Band. and I just think it would be a really strong opener. It would be fascinating to see what McCartney would have made of that bass line. It's pretty damn good. Pretty near a Beatles song anyway, because you've got Ringo on drums on Plastic Ono Band, but with Paul on the bass. Not sure what role there would have been for George on this track, because there isn't much guitar to speak of at all. Maybe that he could have played along, I'm not sure. But anyway, that was my opener, and then we slip into, a bit like on Abbey Road when George just followed a Lennon song with something. I followed a Lennon song with George's Aware of Darkness, which is one of the highlights of All Things Must Pass, but one of the less spoken about tracks compared to some of the others on that album. But for me, well, it's not, obviously it's pretty well known, but people don't absolutely rave about it in the same way, I don't think, or maybe they do. Anyway, I think that would be great to have on a Beatles album. Every Night follows from McCartney, just a beautiful highlight from the McCartney album, and I think he could have fleshed it out more and had more of a group effort with more instrumentation and maybe some added instrumentation. I'm not sure, I hadn't really thought about it. It's quite nice as it is, but maybe he could have fleshed it out a tiny bit. I remember reading somewhere that someone thought Phoebe Snow's cover of Every Night was better because she'd done justice to the song, whereas McCartney hadn't. Well, I think that's ridiculous. I think it's brilliant on McCartney, and it would have been brilliant on a Beatles album. End of story from my side anyway. And then I followed that with, again, From the Yang to the Yin, Every Night, a beautiful love song to Working Class Hero from John. A bit mischievous in the programming there. I thought about this because this is, we know and love this as a Lennon solo song, but it would have been quite interesting to have Lennon slip it on a Beatles album with the F word and all that. It wouldn't have been a single, but he would have got away with it, and I think he would have insisted it went on the album, actually, if I know John. Wah Wah from Harrison follows. Again, I wasn't sure whether to include this because the lyrical subject matter is pretty much aimed at Paul and aimed at the rest of the group, and he's had enough, and he wants to he made me such a big star. I'm thinking of you and all the things that we used to do. But he basically wants out at this stage, written just after the day he left the Beatles during the Let It Be sessions. But it's such a great rocker. I think the Beatles could have swallowed their pride and thought, okay, well, George is having a go at us, but let's put it down. It works well then, and said, yeah, let's do it. So I like to think they would have put down a glorious version of this, maybe with less of the Phil Spector wall of sound, and so we can hear the instruments more. Paul on the bass. Well, Klaus does a good job, but it's a bit buried in the mix on Phil's version. I followed that with Teddy Boy from McCartney, and I know that they tried and failed with this one on the Let It Be sessions. John in particular got bored of it, but it still stands. I think that's just a reflection how it was at the period between the group. Maybe they just didn't have that much patience with each other's material. So maybe a bit hypothetical to do this whole exercise, but it's good fun anyway. And I think Teddy Boy as a song is worthy. So I think it's beautiful, actually. I think it's highly worthy of a Beatles album, and so I put it on there. And I've ended side one with Isolation, the same way, interestingly enough, that Isolation ends side one of Plastic Ono Band. I don't really see that you can put it in the middle of a side with all that shouting in the middle, but anyway, great tune, great piano from John, who just really learnt the piano. He could play before, but I think he'd learnt to play a little bit more proficiently, and Klaus Voormann in that documentary about Plastic Ono Band is raving about those chord changes at the beginning. A work of genius, and I agree. So that ends side one. And we turn over to side two of this hypothetical Lost Beatles album from 1970, and we open with Maybe I'm Amazed, which I think is a natural opener for a side, and on Wings Over America it opens side two, of course. On the McCartney album it was rather mysteriously buried towards the end of side two, and also a little bit underperformed or under-rehearsed, and I would have loved, this is one solo song which I would die to have heard the group perform, either on Abbey Road or here on a hypothetical post-split album. I just think they would have, instead of Linda singing the harmony, we would have had John and George singing that harmony. Instead of Paul doing his guitar solo, which he does quite well, we would have had George Harrison doing one of his masterpieces. The mind boggles as to how well they could have done this track, and they all liked it. They all admitted they liked it, George and John included. Brilliant. My Sweet Lord from George next, and again I thought about whether to put this on, whether John or Paul might have vetoed this song from a Beatles album, but I don't think so. George had introduced Indian religion and put some Indian material on Beatles albums before, and this was just an extension of that, really. Okay, a bit more directly religious, and we won't mention the plagiarism suit, but I think it's just a glorious song, and regardless of how similar it is to He's So Fine, it's just one of his best solo performances. Guitar solo, the sounds of those guitars, the sounds of the George O'Hara Smith singers, which on this version would have been John, Paul and George singing mass harmonies, which would have been very interesting. And Ringo's on drums on the All Things Must Pass album anyway, so not too hard to imagine this being a Beatles track. Anyway, this is all fun, as we know. So then I've slightly mischievously followed that with I Found Out from Lennon, where, he's poo-pooing religion. I've seen religion from Jesus to Paul. I've been through it all. Don't let them fool you with dope and cocaine. Feel your own pain. So a bit of a contrast there from John, but we're used to that kind of variety of sentiment and a variety of musical style on Beatles albums, so this is no different from that. Followed that with the whimsical, lovely That Would Be Something, the second track from the McCartney album, which is just a gem, and I'm not sure whether he would have asked the others to join him on this track or just done a kind of solo kind of version, a bit like he did with Blackbird. It's obviously got that great bass playing on it, and that guitar line is obviously McCartney's on the McCartney album. Maybe he would have asked George to play that here. Would have been interesting. That's actually one of the two songs that George Harrison singles out that he likes from the McCartney album around the time of that album's release. So it would have been interesting for George to have contributed, and I don't know what John would have done here. Ringo could have easily drummed along and it would have been really nice, or maybe, as I say, it would have been a solo McCartney effort, which was not unheard of on Beatles albums. Then I've got Love from Lennon, which is just a glorious love song and just worthy of any album ever, Beatles included. Lennon solo album, one of the highlights of Plastic Ono Band, which is my favourite solo album of all time anyway, and it's an absolute highlight and it's absolutely beautiful. Followed that with Junk from McCartney, from the first solo album McCartney, which actually, interesting, recently we saw released as one of the Isha demos. So they had it written and demoed at the time of the White Album. For some reason it was left off, maybe just because of space reasons. They had too many similar type tracks, but it's beautiful. I think when Lennon was dismissing Ram, he's saying, I prefer the first album because at least it had some songs on it. I think he was referring to tracks like this. I'm pretty sure Lennon appreciated Junk. And then I finished off the album with the title track of All Things Must Pass from George, which is just glorious. I know again that they tried this in the Let It Be sessions, and for some mysterious reason they'd failed to groove and put down a decent... It's embarrassing to hear the anthology version of this track, and it's ironic that McCartney on the Concert for George performed this track the year after George died, maybe feeling a little guilty that he hadn't done justice to this track back in the time of Let It Be sessions. Anyway, I think they would have, had they not split, they would have come to realise that actually there is a bloody good song underneath their previous attempts, and they would have gone back to it and done it justice, and probably not come up with a version which is a million miles away from the George version on All Things Must Pass, which we all know and love. So that's the album. And then as a bonus track, I've got Art of Dying from Harrison, which is a great rocker, great guitar. I've steered clear of Waiting on You All. I think Art of Dying is the rocker they would have chosen. And then Ringo hasn't got a track on this album. And one of the reasons is because he didn't write any songs in 1970, but his two solo albums, Sentimental Journey and Beaucoups of Blues, had some great stuff on it. And I've got as a bonus track Loser's Lounge from Bo Coops of Blues. Would have been nice to have done a nice fast country track with the other Beatles. That's the one I've chosen. So, this is it. My Lost Beatles album, Volume 1, 1970. 5 John, 5 Paul, 4 George, and for the first time ever, apart from Hard Day's Night, no Ringo. Thank you for watching. See you next time.